Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, exploring the cultures of consciousness. Today, philosophy and science fiction. A couple of years ago, I had the great privilege of speaking at the Philip K. Dick conference or festival, and now I'm forgetting what exactly its name was, up here at San Francisco State, organized by our friend David Gill, and it was a blast. And I should also say that a similar conference is coming up this year at UC Fullerton. I think they're calling it the PKD PKD Convention. And it's at the conference. It's Cal State Fullerton at the end of April. So I think the papers are already in, but it should be a pretty good time. We certainly had a good time in San Francisco a couple of years ago, and one of the features, of course, of such good times is meeting interesting people from afar. And one of the folks I met whose conversation I particularly enjoyed was James Burton. James is a British scholar who got his degree at Cambridge and then went on to Goldsmiths in London, working on cultural studies and English. And now he's really working on philosophy and literature, media studies in Berlin. And so he covers a wide range of topics, but his first book is called The Philosophy of Science Fiction, Henri Bergson and the Fabulations of Philip K. Dick. Now, the word philosophy is a kind of difficult one in some ways in our era today. On the one hand, you say it and it sounds like things are going to become sort of boring and pretentious. And really, it's a sign of how far the spirit of philosophy has gotten from its, I won't say origins, but its long-standing tradition as a place to ask the fundamental questions about life and to get down to the nitty-gritty, to take our primal hopes, fears, desires, speculations, doubts, skepticisms, and work them out in an articulate fashion in conversation in the spirit of pursuing higher values, and has become rather mechanical and at least very professional operation that turns off most people when they hear the term. On the other hand, it's also gotten kind of sort of degraded sense as well. I think there already is a book on philosophy and Philip K. Dick, and there's this sort of series of books out there, I think largely by different editors, but they sort of saw there was a market to do kind of like the philosophy in Star Trek and philosophy in The Matrix, philosophy in Philip K. Dick. The idea is you take some pop cultural phenomenon that has some vaguely epistemological, ontological problems. What is reality? How do we know? And then you write these kind of quirky, cute little explorations and essays into the issues raised. You know, I can't badmouth the whole thing. Some of it's sort of interesting, but most of the quote-unquote philosophy represented in these, I think, is pretty low grade in the sense that it's not really engaging with the deeper existential, sort of deeply historically informed questions that go into philosophy as I enjoy and understand it. These philosophy of books also tend to be more analytic in their orientation, and it's probably worthwhile to say that to kind of make the somewhat hackneyed but still very helpful distinction between analytic philosophy, which is the philosophy that's dominated the English-speaking world over the last century or so, America and the UK, and then continental philosophy. And in some sense, these two streams have been separated for all sorts of reasons. On the one side, you have a kind of what you might think of as a more rationalist orientation, often very close to the sciences, to linguistics, to logic, and often featuring a kind of hostilities to the fuzzier, more existential and sometimes even religious questions that you'll find in the continental tradition, which is more the tradition of Nietzsche and Heidegger, Derrida, et cetera, and that's more my home base, and it's also more James's home base, and Henri Bergson, who's the main philosopher that he's writing about in relationship to Philip K. Dick in his book, The Philosophy of Science Fiction, also comes out of this stream and was also an important influence on Gilles Deleuze. I think some folks out there have been drawing these connections already. And I should say that James's book, like too many books these days, and it's not his fault, is pretty expensive the way it is academic books. It has yet to see paperback, so I'm hoping we'll see a paperback version of it because it's a wonderful book. It's well written. It's not too technical, tough to follow. And he really does get down to brass tacks, to the nitty-gritty, to what does it mean to be thinking today, to what does it mean to be creating fictions that are also forms of thought, not just forms of entertainment or forms of distraction, but how we fictionalize or fabulate, invent, create, poeticize in order to get ourselves out of the traps that we have made for ourselves. And this is one of the main themes that he draws between Bergson and Philip K. Dick, and it's a theme that we should all be thinking about for any number of reasons in our crazy apocalyptic times. So, with no further ado, let's bring James onto the show. James, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Hi, thanks for having me. Great to hear you, Erik.
Great. Yeah, you do sound a little bit underwater, but we'll have to.
Okay.
We'll have to. Sometimes the Skype is as clear as a bell, and sometimes it's not. So.
Okay, I'll try and stick close as possible to the computer.
Yeah, that would be good. Okay, so you're studying philosophy. You're studying media studies. You're working on towards your dissertation. What brought you to Philip K. Dick? I mean, you can see the appeal of his work from a philosophical dimension. And what I think we might do is why don't can you call a number here in the States, because you're pretty unclear. And it'd be quite bad. So I'm going to give you the number just over the line here. I'll type it in, and just if you could call that, and I can keep talking as we go. And remember, it's in the States, so you got to put a 01 in front of it. I'm not positive about that. You probably know that better than I do. Anyway, so I'm just going to riff a little bit as you do the phoning there about the philosophical dimension of Philip K. Dick. I mean, he's a really unusual science fiction writer in the sense. On the one hand, he's incredibly popular, especially now, more so than in during his life. And he does raise these fundamental questions about reality. What's the nature of reality? How do we know what we know? What makes humans humans? What makes machines machines? Can machines be human? Can humans be machines? And in his essays and lectures, he really goes after this stuff. But he's a funny kind of thinker. On the one hand, and he's sort of well exposed to philosophical ideas, to the history of philosophy. And on the other hand, he's kind of a garage philosopher. That's what I like to call him. The same way that a garage band will take elements of, of music, of punk, of rock and roll, of blues, and just kind of mash it together kind of on your own and not really care so much about fidelity, about professional slickness. In a way, he was kind of a garage philosopher, playing with ideas, combining them, slamming them up against each other in ways that more professional philosophers would never do. They've been trained how to think more systematically, more carefully about certain things. And so with Dick, you have this kind of open-ended, but I think we're not getting the number there. So I guess for the time being, are you doing the whatever the pre-number?
Yeah, I've done everything. How's the quality at the moment?
Okay, well, then we'll just we'll stick with this as it is.
Let me know.
Maybe we can try to call. Let's try to call one more time.
Okay. Yeah.
So PRN, please. We'll hang up and try this one more time. Sorry for this, folks.
Okay, great.
So let's go back to it.
Sure.
I did my little ramble about Philip K. Dick and philosophy, and I'm just curious from that perspective of being someone interested in these philosophical issues, what was it that captured you and engaged you about Philip K. Dick?
So, I mean, one of the things that I really appreciate about Philip Dick as a philosopher is exactly what you summarized so well with this term garage philosopher. And I've referred to that as well, and I know a few philosophers who picked up on that. So, yeah, this is one quality of Dick as a philosopher, is the way because he's so self-taught, as you mentioned, he's not a professionally trained philosopher, and sort of being outside of that philosophical professional sphere means he doesn't have to follow any of the conventions that a professional philosopher has to follow. And that means he can pick up philosophical ideas from all over the place, from different thinkers, and tinker with them, and put them together, and see how they work, and see how that sparks off chains of ideas, of thoughts, and even stories for him, and follow up the implications of those without having to get too bogged down in all of the sort of philosophical analytic detail of teasing out every sort of definition and qualification. But it's not just that. I think another aspect to what makes Dick interesting is that he does have exactly the kind of philosophical spirit that you spoke about in the intro, which is a sort of a sense of wonder at this vastness of the universe and how much of it is unknown, and at the fact that within that there's still the possibility for a conscious living being to try to figure out some of it, to try to make some headway. But as I say, he's too impatient to do that in what you referred to as an analytic sort of approach, to just say, okay, let's test a little piece of reality, let's do some empirical research, come up with a very tentative theory and keep testing and fleshing that out. It's more like he says, well, there's so much we don't know out there. Let's start by saying, well, what if this is how it works? And follow that up and think about the implications of that. And then when that runs a little bit dry or boring, let's try another idea. Let's move on to this other possibility and say, okay, what if the reality I perceive is completely constructed on a computer? How does that change the way? And how could I figure out if that were the case? How could I test that? So there's these elements, but there's another aspect that's very important to me, and that's alongside this kind of sense of wonder, there's also a desperation. And for me, that's really behind a lot of Dick's philosophizing and fictionalizing, or fictional philosophizing as well. There's this need for salvation. There's a need for something that would sort of unlock all of this great mystery of the universe and tell him, you're not alone. There's a reason you're here. A little bit like, philosophers express this desperation as well through the years. You have theologians like Augustine saying, I'm in despair. Why won't God explain to me the nature of temporality? Why won't he let me figure it out? Why is my mind not capable of understanding? And I think there's that in Dick as well. So it's a combination of all these things, the tinkering, or the garage philosophy, the sense of wonder, and the need to get somewhere, the need to find out. And since you can't find out just by looking and thinking, you've got to start fictionalizing. You've got to start exploring possibilities and going with it and seeing where they take you. So those are all the things that interest me.
Yeah, I mean that's very very well put. Especially the emphasis on the kind of desperation, that he wasn't unwilling. He was unwilling to give up on the quest even when it seemed futile. and that ongoingness then kind of manifests partly in all the stories and the intensity of their writing and the intensity of the thinking, but it also draws you as a reader, as a fellow traveler, into the quest. So even if maybe on your own you wouldn't ask these questions with this degree of intensity, reading his fictions and his essays as well, and the exegesis also, there's a kind of sense that you're along for the ride. And I think one of the things that you're doing, which is unusual for philosophers working today, is that you're still interested in this question of salvation, but you're not thinking about it in terms of some transcendental other realm, some realm of heavenly values or abstract principles that are outside of our world, the world that we share, the world that's groaning so violently today in so many ways. But you're also not interested in abandoning that category. Instead, you're showing how that category, the quest for salvation, and the way that both thought and fiction play a role in the quest for salvation, can be part of what we do here on this world together to get to a better place. And that's something you find in PKD, and it's also something that you find in Bergson, and that's really in a lot of ways the connection between them. Some people aren't that familiar with Bergson, so it would be great if you could just say a little bit about him, his life, and what some of the main ideas are or the kind of role he played in asking questions in certain ways that help illuminate what Dick's project is.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right with this sort of dual exigency, let's say, of needing salvation, but also needing it within a broadly secular materialist kind of worldview and world situation, is this strange sort of almost contradictory pairing that for me is one of the things that linked Dick and Bergson. Yes, a bit of background on Bergson. I know, I think you had Rupert Sheldrake on the podcast recently. He mentioned Bergson's Matter and Memory, which was a key text in rethinking the ways we understand memory from the late 19th century. And what Bergson did was he, in a number of works, he looked at questions like free will, the nature of time, the nature of memory, and the nature of evolution. And in all of the works, he tried to look at it from a non-mechanistic perspective. It doesn't mean a spiritualist or a transcendental perspective, but just to say, what if these things don't operate like a machine or according to a non-creative set of determinate laws, which was kind of the vogue of the day following Darwin, but also Herbert Spencer and people like that. So, for example, with memory, the received wisdom at the time was, memories must be stored somewhere in the brain. So a memory is formed and it's stored as information, and when you need it, you retrieve it, or you fail to retrieve it if you can't find it, but it's there somewhere, just like a library or a computer hard drive. And that was kind of a long tradition of understanding memory. And Bergson comes along and says, well, if we take another approach, if we assume that memories aren't single units of information or things that can be stored, but there's a more of a continuous process of experience that we somehow carry with us all the time, then we can try to understand memory as not stored somewhere, but as somehow always all present, even if it's not always conscious. So he does these kind of studies. He argues for a similar thing in terms of evolution a little bit later, around the beginning of the 1900s, and says that, what if evolution isn't just a series of natural selective sort of mechanical processes, but there is some sort of creative activity within it without having to say that's God or that's a transcendental figure. And then there's this Then there's this break in his output, at least in terms of major works. He's very successful, very famous by that point, and the First World War comes along, and he doesn't produce any work for a while. And then after the war, he's working with the League of Nations and trying to work on preventing future wars with people like Einstein and Thomas Mann and Paul Valéry. And so there's this 25-year gap between the writing on evolution and the work which I used to look at Philip Dick, which is The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. That comes out in 1932. And there he does something which people had asked him to do for a quarter of a century, but he resisted doing, which was to really make explicit the social, political, ethical implications of his philosophy. And he starts to look at how it is that society is formed and how religion is formed and where our sort of ideas of morality come from and what their role is in an evolutionary sort of development. And crucially for me, he comes up with this notion of fabulation, of fictionalizing as playing a crucial role in the evolution of society and religion and morality. And the way fabulation works in Bergson is he says, okay, let's say humans evolved an intellect which allows them to reason and be rational and to make reasonable predictions about things that are going to happen and to calculate, and obviously this helps them survive. But it also leads down some pretty antisocial, destructive paths, such as you reason that people are mortal because you see people dying, and you say, well, I'm going to die in the end too, so what's the point? Why don't I just give up? Or you say, I need these resources, and those people over there have got those resources, and I have the power to take it from them, so why don't I just take it instead of growing my own plants or building my own dwelling spaces or something? And for Bergson, fabulation comes in as an evolved mechanism for countering those tendencies, which are fundamentally antisocial. And fabulation says, gives the human the ability to say, maybe there's some other force that I haven't quite perceived that will intervene if I, go and kill those people over there and take their crops or whatever. So, or maybe the mortality isn't what it seems to be. Maybe the person doesn't disappear from the universe when their body dies. Maybe there's something which we will later come to call a soul. And so these mechanisms intervene, these sort of fictionalizing abilities to stop us behaving in this mechanistic and destructive rationalistic way. And that's where I took the fabulation from. And then it ends up, by extension, playing a new role under the sort of hyper-mechanistic conditions of industrial modernity.
Well, that's what's so interesting about it. I mean, you think about, the idea of what a philosopher would be doing today, and it seems like for a lot of them, they probably consider it part of their raison d'etre in the world is to expunge fabulation and fictions and hallucinations and stories, and return us all to the rigor of reason. But what Bergson is saying is that on its own terms or in its own space, divorced from a larger context, a larger story, that reason can be actually destructive to society, and exactly. That fabulations come in, and it's not even just that the fabulations that people invent. Let's say a story I decide to tell about the soul or the greater goods that you get in heaven for doing good to your neighbor. But he also talks about, if you will, unconscious phantasms. He has that example that you quote in your book about the woman who's going towards an elevator shaft, and she thinks that the elevator is going to be there because that's where it usually is when the doors open. It's actually not there. And then at the last minute, just before she steps to her doom, she has a hallucination of a person there pushing her back. And it's the idea there is, and it was just a hallucination, but it prevented her from going over the edge. The idea there is that the force of fabulation itself, the fiction making that isn't just ours because we're choosing to do it, but it comes through us through dreams, it comes through us through shared impressions, through rumor, through visionary experience, that these things themselves may be playing a role in pointing us away from a strictly mechanical, reason-driven way of being in the world.
Exactly. And that's precisely why this fits into this sort of dichotomy that you highlighted at the beginning, where we're talking about things that are normally couched in terms of transcendent forces or agents, but still staying within a broadly materialist or secular sort of worldview, and saying, well, how can those two things cohere or cohabit? So, and the woman in the lift is a great example of that, because you say, okay, this person would fall to their death without some kind of fiction to intervene, and so even before they consciously work it out, somehow their body or their mind produces this fiction which saves her. And so she really has been saved, and really by something which to her conscious mind is an exterior agent. She doesn't until later realize that she's the person who came up with this, if she is at all. And so you end up walking this line between the immanent and the transcendent, or between sort of salvation in the most mundane sense of saving your life from falling down a lift shaft or off a cliff, and salvation in the religious or theological sense of, a God intervening to save you. And you're absolutely right. That's one of the things that is interesting in terms of the link or the resonance between Dick and Bergson, is that I think they both have this kind of openness to the role that fiction and fabulation and the transcendent, or the idea of the transcendent, have to play in human social and psychic life, but they both have enough skepticism and sort of worldliness to say it's probably not a good idea to just hope that comes along, that God comes in to save us, or that something's going into being of its own accord. So I better look for that somehow in my own creativity. But of course, that leads you into all these paradoxes that we've talked about before in the exegesis, where Dick is constantly having to create some kind of savior figure, and then sort of forget that he created it, or come up with an idea that might save him from despair or whatever, and then sort of obscure the way that arose, so that you can still treat it as an exterior agent, a divine exterior or alien god or something.
Yes, indeed. I mean, that's the kind of paradox that, it seems like we find ourselves in terms of, recognizing the value of, let's call it religion, let's call it visionary, let's call it sort of anomalous perceptions or experiences in any number of ways. We recognize the value of that, and at the same time, because of our knowledge about neuroscience, our knowledge about social psychology, our sort of philosophical commitments to a broadly, let's say, materialistic view or secular view of the world, that it's really hard to figure out how to make room for those experiences and ideas, particularly when you can look out and see forms of religious thinking, fundamentalism, for example, that is clearly bound up with violence and a closed society. So it becomes very difficult to figure out where to put these things, how to justify them, if you will. And it does seem like one of your goals as a thinker, in the face of a lot of much more hard-edged kind of secular thought or rationalist thought today, one of your goals is to make a space, a way of understanding how we can still engage with these sort of religious or visionary forces without checking our brains at the door. And that's a real, I mean, that's a paradox that's not just Dick is dealing with, but in some sense, a lot of us who are trying to figure out how to weave these things together, even though in some sense they kind of pull apart. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, and it's actually one of the things I like about the podcast in general, that you're not trying to go one way or the other, but take the difficult line of walking between them and work out how they can both be maintained. This relates as well to what you were saying about philosophy earlier, and in a way to the reception of both Bergson and Dick. So when Dick started to become sort of well known beyond sort of science fiction readers, let's say, towards the end of his life and then afterwards, a lot of the academic interest in his thought came from Marxist scholars who read novels like Ubik as, a great critique of the commodity of capitalism and so on. And a lot of those critics were kind of quite upset when he started writing about religion more explicitly in the late works in Valis and Transmigration of Timothy Archer and Divine Invasion. And as you know, they sort of said, oh, this isn't the good Philip Dick, this is the crazy Philip Dick. And so there's a sort of a desire to expunge all of the transcendental stuff and all of the wackiest stuff that can't be reduced to a kind of critique of capitalism or mainstream society. And there's a strong parallel in the reception of Bergson, because he was immensely popular in his own lifetime, and then sometime in the 20s, so before this work that deals with religion and fabulation came out, his star began to wane a bit. Bertrand Russell said he was just a poet, and that was supposed to be a denigration, an insult rather than a compliment. And so he kind of got forgotten through the middle of the 20th century. And then, as you said earlier on, Gilles Deleuze picked up on him and found him very influential. So when Deleuze became very popular, people started to read Bergson again, and there was this gradual revival. So by around the 90s and then the past decade, suddenly Bergson's read again. But even within that period, from when Deleuze was reading him and talking about him from, say, the late 50s to now, that last work on society and religion and on fabulation stayed neglected. And I think a large reason for that is it is the one that most seems to imply some sort of dealing with the transcendent, with with fictionalizing as a part of a positive, rational, and ethical philosophy and outlook. And so that's kind of had to be still kept in brackets. So when Deleuze wrote his book, Bergsonism, the two sources only comes up in the last 2 pages, and he only gives the title in a footnote, whereas he talks about all the other major works extensively. And it's as though, there's this fear of, if we bring back transcendence, we're bringing back all of the things that are dangerous in society, not only because of fundamentalism and the dangers of religion and the history of religion, but also because capitalism works by pulling the wool over your eyes, works by ideology, the opiate of the masses and all of this sort of thing. And that's the stuff we have to cut through, and which historical materialism and Marxism really tried to get away from. And so I think, the big danger there is that you throw out all of the positive value of fictionalizing or fabulation, along with the negative aspects, the destructive aspects. And I think that's changing a bit in philosophy in the last 15 years or so. There is more of an acceptance, just like the analytic continental divide that you referred to is slowly sort of breaking down a bit. And analytic philosophers are starting to say, okay, maybe not everything is explainable by a set of logical propositions. And continental thinkers are starting to say sometimes, okay, sometimes maybe we sound a bit too poetic or obscure, and we're not against analytic thinking, obviously. So I see that these things are slowly sort of changing a bit. You have someone like Alain Badiou, a committed Marxist, writing about the birth of Christianity, for example. So there are ways in which this is shifting now, I think.
You know, to make a plug for your book, it's probably too much to go into much detail on it, but I particularly loved your chapter about St. Paul, because if you're interested in the conversation of between religion and philosophy, and particularly one that's a conversation that's intensified, perhaps made even a bit desperate by our current conditions, where it looks like, you know, there's no other option to capitalism. And if you look at, I mean, I'm not saying there isn't one, but it feels like there's no way to think our way, to get our way, make a movement, make an alternative. It becomes increasingly difficult to even imagine an alternative to capitalism. And at the same time, whatever you want to say about capitalism as a system compared to other forms of political economy, et cetera, it seems very clear that capitalism is not going to be able to deal with the global ecological crisis. So we're on this, you know, train that's chugging at a quick clip, and it looks like it's going off a cliff. And so, you know, it's a somewhat desperate time. And it's interesting the way that St. Paul, this sort of figure from Christianity, emerges as this important figure in this conversation between religion and philosophy, and so you talk very elegantly in one of your chapters about Paul and his relationship to some contemporary thinkers, Alain Badiou and Agamben. But it's also, of course, if you're a Phil Dick head, you're going, yeah, and it's like Paul is the most important figure for Phil Dick's Christianity. He's way more important than Jesus. Dick doesn't talk about Jesus very much. He talks a lot about Paul. And so there's this sense that there's something in that moment where that is resonating across these multiple figures.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And I think in a way, before all of these contemporary philosophers, Dick sort of intuitively takes Paul back to a kind of a more sort of, I don't know, pragmatic but on the one hand, and on the other hand, sort of fictionalizing figure who, you know, it's almost as though he makes him more Gnostic than Christian, because, or maybe more in the spirit of a certain spirit of Christianity than the spirit of the Christian Church, let's say. And yeah, with this idea of the Black Iron Prison that Dick has, he's pretty much anticipating, albeit through a series of visions and then all of the endless writings on those visions, things that Badiou is saying 25 years later about St. Paul. So Badiou comes up with this idea that, you know, Paul's struggle against the Roman Empire is a struggle against not just a real empire, but a metaphysical system of oppression that entraps individuals and restricts their subjectivity and basically mechanizes them, in Bergson's terminology, or androidizes them, as Dick would say, turns them into androids. The way Badiou puts it is that it puts life under the sign of death. Makes life into a kind of non-life, and that's basically turning you into an android, a mechanical being. And so, yeah, I think. And what's interesting about that is when Dick had this vision of the Black Iron Prison, it came to him in a fabulation, in a sort of unconscious. It just happened to him, and then he had to explain it afterwards. And so the things that, for some people at the time and since, were the most crazy, whacked out aspects of Dick's ideas, turn out to be the things that sort of now take on a certain cultural capital within philosophy, for example. At least these areas of continental philosophy. Zizek and Agamben and Badiou all talking in similar terms, and even emphasizing the role of creativity and fiction. So Badiou says, for the resurrection to have any value, it has to be understood that it's not a historical event, that it's a fiction, that it's a fiction which symbolizes the way anybody can have a resurrection of their subjectivity and a sort of rebirth. And, if you didn't know that was Badiou, you'd think it was a New Age spiritualist telling you that.
No, it's true. It's really quite remarkable. And I want to stay with this tension between the Black Iron Prison and this sort of notion of a kind of escape or a wrench in the works, just because it's so important. That the metaphor of the Black Iron Prison and the notion of a kind of mechanized civilization that works not only in terms of exterior machines, but forms of power and domination that become kind of regulated from above, and which increasingly take the form of a prison. I think it's a pretty good way of describing the civilization that we've created from ourselves. Much more terrifyingly than industrialism. Might have looked at the industrial age as being an era of mechanization. Human labor was turned into mechanical labor in the regulations of the factory and the 16-hour day and the organizations of the body that then have to act like robots. And so the robot is kind of the figure. But of course we're post-industrial now, and it's much more subtle and insidious the forms of mechanization that we're facing. I mean, really it's about the algorithm and the way that our behavior is anticipated, guided, often invisibly by all of the algorithms that support and drive our communications with technology, let alone the way that capitalism itself is mutating magnificently in bizarre and extraordinary science fictional ways because of the increased power, the unleashed power of digital intelligence. And so, the Black Iron Prison is much more cozy these days. I mean, meaning it's much more in your face. And so it's interesting to think about, again, whether we think about Badiou and the way that he likes St. Paul, because St. Paul is saying, no, there's a way out. There's a way out of this otherwise completely dominant system, which is not just a political system, but a whole sort of metaphysics of control, a metaphysics of death, a metaphysics of the law. And there's a way out. There's this break, almost a Gnostic break, we could say, although he wouldn't like those terms, though Dick would. And in Dick's terms, I think this break is best seen through a notion that you pick up in your book as well, and that I think is one of the most important ethical ideas that Dick has, and one that is very relevant to more quote-unquote sophisticated philosophical discussions, and that is the notion of balking, B-A-L-K-I-N-G, balking, the ethics of balking. He talks about it. What does Dick mean by balking, and how does that respond to the sort of situation of the Black Iron Prison that we're in?
That's a great thing to pick up on there. I mean, first of all, I completely agree with you about this sort of way that capitalism magnificently adapts to everything, and how it already seems outdated to refer to just people being mechanized in the way we think of being cogs in the factory, machine in the system, which is also still true. But like as you say, today the Black Iron Prison allows you plenty of creative freedom, and we can all blog, and we can all make music, and feel like we have lots and lots of freedom for expression. And yet, through that, we will be constantly contributing through these different algorithms to consumer databases of knowledge and things that are sort of cybernetically mapping our behavior patterns and our tastes and interests. And there was an article recently by some scientists who showed that Google could sway the next US election if they wanted to, and of course Google comes out and says, oh no, we couldn't, and then we wouldn't anyway. And it sort of Okay, you wouldn't is one question, but it matters if whether you could or not. But anyway, to come to this question of bulking, yeah, it's one of these terms that Dick uses a lot, and at first you get the impression it's just sort of one of his sort of choice vocabulary things. Everybody has a certain kind of phrase that they tend to use, and then he somehow, somewhere along the line, realizes. I think it might be when Greg Rickman asks him about it in the interview. Um, you know, he points out, you use this word bulking a lot. What does it mean to you? What does it signify? And Dick says, well, it means that in the face of these things that are not right about the world, these mechanizing aspects of the Black Iron Prison, when something is trying to sway your behavior a certain way, which deep down you know is unethical or wrong, to bulk is to sort of to say no, to back off and not do that. And it's not a heroic gesture of defiance in the way we sometimes think of sort of acts of resistance, and it's not also a kind of absolute refusal, but it's more like a minor gesture, a quiet backing up, a quiet saying no. And I mean, one of the best moments for me in Dick's fiction of this is the scene in The Man in the High Castle, where the Japanese diplomat, who's a member of the occupying force, I guess a lot of people know the plot now because it's a major TV series, but the basic premise is that Japan and the Nazis win the Second World War and are occupying Europe and America and the rest of the world. And there's this Japanese diplomat who refuses to sign a piece of paper ordering someone's death, and that other someone is a character we know. And he's bulking then. He's not defying the authority in some dramatic, forceful way. He's just saying, no, I won't put my signature down on this piece of paper. And that person will live. He doesn't know that person. So it's not out of love or, it's not like a close friend and, emotionally bound to them. It's just a small act of saying, no, this is wrong, I'm not going along with it. And from that, I think, from something very small and simple, Dick develops this, this ethical, implicit ethics, which is quite interesting because it's not bound to a carefully worked out moral system, and it relies on what you intuitively know is right or wrong. And it sort of goes back to like the basics of ethics, but somehow in a way that doesn't have to have it bound up with a whole philosophical or religious system. It says it's all much more simple than you think. Just don't sign that piece of paper.
Absolutely, and it's something internal as well. It's almost this kind of, gesture of just release, like not hearing the story. And it reminds me of another conversation I was having with someone, and they were talking about how, these days, like one of the things that we all do, especially when we're interacting with social media and we're online and we're like, or we're on Twitter or whatever, we get some information, maybe some historical tragedy, some new terrifying news or whatever it is, and then we pass it on, and we kind of feel somehow by passing it on, we're somehow doing something, we're helping, we're illuminating, we're letting people know what really is affecting us, as we try to navigate through our crazy era. And they were like, but maybe that's just like the wrong way to think about it, that in some ways all we're doing is we're spreading a kind of collective, vibrating, resonating meme of fear and whatever it is, and that in some ways the more difficult work is to stop, is to not pass it on, is to not let the thing keep going. And to me that really resonates with this small gesture of balking. Obviously, this is not going to create the revolution, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about creating some space, even within an individual's life or the life of a small community or whatever, the immediate networks of friends and colleagues, where a different logic becomes available rather than one in which we're just kind of going along with the flow, going along with the ride, and recovering that sense of balking is again, it has something to do with just kind of stopping.
Exactly. Because as one of the biggest problems today with trying to act ethically when we're worried about war and human suffering, but also climate change and ecological catastrophe and so on. One of the biggest issues is you get overwhelmed. Like there's a horrible news story coming at you from every angle every day. Like you say, everyone's passing them on, and we're all showing our solidarity somehow by passing them on and sharing them. And I mean, whether or not we should or shouldn't is one thing, but what does happen is that you get to a level of being overwhelmed, such that it becomes very difficult. You sort of end up second guessing yourself with every kind of decision you make. Like, if I recycle, well, that's not going to save the world, is it? Or should I sort of share this petition with my friends and get them to sign it? Oh, should I or shouldn't I? You can get so hung up on making these decisions that I think in the end you might end up just doing nothing. And in some senses, you can turn doing nothing into a positive gesture by saying, no, I'm not going to do this. It might not be, I'm not going to share this. It might be, I am going to share this. But I think the thing is not to get sort of overwhelmed by it. And at some point you say, well, I've got to trust my intuition. I can't work out how this plays into the whole big scheme of geopolitics and so on, or into an ethical system. I'm just going to have to trust my intuition.
What's so funny is that actually brings us back to, arguably one of the origin stories of philosophy in itself, which is Socrates' daemon. So Socrates says he has this daemon, this spirit that has been with him throughout his life, who guides him. And, from a occultist point of view, you could go, okay, I know what this is about. It's sort of like the holy guardian angel or some kind of spirit helper. But what's interesting is that I don't remember what texts you probably do because your philosophy, where this daemon is described as basically just saying no, like suggest, you might not want to do this, Socrates, or I don't think so. It was largely a force of the negative, not in the kind of critical sense of the negative, but in the sense of just saying, no, maybe you don't want to do that.
Yeah, no, and that also brings us back to a question we started with, which is, the role of fictionalizing in philosophy and the role of these kind of, weird superstitious elements. Plato wouldn't be Plato without stories like Gyges' ring, about the ring that makes someone invisible, or all of these kind of fables and so on that he draws on. And one of the weird things that you touched on right at the beginning is the way philosophy and science at these different moments in its history suddenly becomes obsessed with expunging all of these fictional elements. Anything that relates to the religious or the mystical or the irrational is suddenly really taboo and has to be pushed out and banned. And yet, philosophy and science couldn't function without some kind of philosophizing, and not just telling stories like fables and so on, but also in the very thinking about theory or what is possible, how the world might be. You're always already fictionalizing. The moment you try to come up with a theory, you're in the realm of fiction. It might not be so explicit. It might not be a Philip K story, but it's there. And so it's one of the weird things that philosophy tries to get rid of it. And I think if we do try to say, well, all of that stuff is irrational and associated with things that have been historically bad for civilization or for the human race or the planet, then we're missing out on the ways they've also been constituted. It doesn't make sense to put fiction on one side or the other. It's like any other kind of tool that we've had in our history to develop and to change things. It can be incredibly destructive and it can be incredibly useful. And if we just get rid of it because it's sometimes destructive, then we're losing something really valuable, really useful. And I think Bergson and Dick are both thinkers who try to walk both sides of that. They're both saying, we need this ability, we need fabulation, we need, and in Dick's case, I need and we need something like God, something beyond reality as it appears to be, something beyond me and other people, something else. And yet, he's completely skeptical as well. He's not going to accept any easy answer. So he comes up with Valis or some divine agent, and then he'll subject it to a whole bunch of tests and say, okay. Or like in the fictions, in Galactic Pop Healer, you have the Glimmung, and the Glimmung starts out as this sort of super divine alien that can do things that are beyond human capacity or consciousness, but then it turns out to be fallible and mortal and so on. And it's like Dick will always undercut every sort of transcendent element, but he'll never give up on that transcendence entirely. He'll always sort of, work it and say, okay, this is what we need. We need this savior, we need this God, but it's still got to fit within the real world, or the world as best we understand it. And so I'll wear it down until I get something that I can still believe has that creative, that transcendent spark, but still works within our situation.
Well, James, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for being on Expanding Mind.
Thank you very much, Erik.
All right, James Burton, author of The Philosophy of Science Fiction, Henri Bergson, and the Fabulations of Philip K. Dick. Till next week, keep your minds open.